Bikers threaten a soldier on leave. When they see who shows up, they're speechless. The history of Millbrook was etched into every weathered brick and faded storefront. Once a thriving manufacturing town, it had slowly declined over decades, leaving behind a community that clung to memories of better times. The Reapers had sensed this vulnerability, like predators identifying weak prey. They'd infiltrated the town's economic and social fabric with calculated precision, turning fear into a currency more valuable than money. Tom, the elderly customer nursing his coffee, remembered a different Millbrook. His late wife, Margaret, had been a schoolteacher who believed in the town's potential. She'd always said that communities were like living organisms, capable of healing, of transformation. But even Margaret would have been challenged by the pervasive atmosphere of intimidation that now hung over Main Street. The neon sign of Lou's Diner continued its erratic dance, casting red and blue shadows that seemed to pulse with an almost supernatural rhythm. Each flicker was a reminder of the town's fragile existence, of the thin line between survival and submission. Sarah Martinez felt this more acutely than most. Her family had owned this diner for 3 generations, and she'd watched its slow decline with a mixture of grief and determination. Outside, the Reapers represented more than just a motorcycle gang. They were a symptom of a deeper wound, the economic despair, the lost hope, the collective trauma that had slowly eroded the town's spirit. Each leather-clad figure was a living testament to dreams deferred, to potential crushed under the weight of circumstance. Dylan's arrival was like a spark of unexpected electricity. Young, uncertain, but unbowed, he represented something the town had almost forgotten, the possibility of resistance. Jake's homecoming was more than a personal journey, it was a ritual of return that countless soldiers understood intimately. The transition from war zones to civilian life was never simple, a delicate dance of readjustment and remembering. His bedroom was a time capsule, preserving moments from before his deployment, a testament to the life that had been paused when he'd chosen to serve. His mother, Elizabeth Carter, had been preparing for this moment for months. Every care package she'd sent, every late-night phone call, every prayer whispered in the local church had been an act of maternal resilience. Military families understood sacrifice in a way few others could comprehend. They lived with a constant undercurrent of worry, their love measured in waiting and hope. The Carter family's military history ran deep. Jake's grandfather had served in Korea, his father in the First Gulf War. Service was more than a profession, it was a calling, a way of understanding oneself and one's place in the world. Jake had internalized these lessons during his years of training and deployment, understanding that true strength was never about violence, but about protection, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Afghanistan had taught him lessons that transcended military strategy. He'd seen communities torn apart by conflict, witnessed the delicate process of rebuilding, of finding hope in seemingly hopeless situations. Those experiences had fundamentally changed him, stripping away any romantic notions of heroism and replacing them with a profound understanding of human resilience. The motorcycle engines outside were a harsh reminder that battles weren't always fought on distant battlefields. Sometimes, they happened in small towns, in parking lots, in the spaces between fear and courage. Dylan's encounter with the Reapers was more than a random confrontation, it was a microcosm of the town's long-standing struggle. Each teenager in Millbrook understood the unspoken rules: keep your head down, don't draw attention, survive. Dylan had been raised differently. The Carter family had always emphasized personal dignity, a concept that transcended physical intimidation. Mr. Reed, Thomas Reed, to those who knew his real history, represented a particular type of trauma. Many of the Reapers were veterans, men who had served their country and returned to find themselves disconnected, marginalized. Their gang was less a criminal enterprise and more a desperate attempt to recreate the sense of brotherhood and purpose they'd experienced in military service. The parking lot became a stage, with unwritten rules of engagement that everyone in Millbrook understood. Confrontations like these weren't just about physical dominance, but about psychological territory: who could claim moral high ground, who could demonstrate true power. Dylan's trembling hand holding the takeout bag was a powerful symbol. He wasn't just carrying dinner, he was carrying his family's hopes, his town's potential for change. Each step was an act of quiet rebellion against the fear that had paralyzed Millbrook for years. The surrounding businesses, Lou's Diner, the hardware store, the flower shop, were silent witnesses. Their windows, their walls held memories of countless similar confrontations, of moments when ordinary people had been forced to choose between submission and dignity. Jake's arrival transformed the dynamic instantly. His military training had taught him that true power wasn't about aggression, but about presence. His stance, his unwavering gaze, communicated volumes without a single raised voice or clenched fist. Millbrook had always been a town of subtle transformations. Economic shifts, demographic changes, the slow erosion of traditional industries, these were the invisible currents that shaped community life. The confrontation between Jake and the Reapers represented something more profound, a psychological turning point. Frank Chen's hardware store was more than a business, it was a community landmark. Established by his immigrant parents who had arrived with nothing but hope and determination, the store had survived multiple economic downturns. The security cameras were a recent addition, installed after years of reluctant compliance with the Reapers' intimidation tactics. Eleanor Wright's flower shop told a different story of resilience. Her orchids were carefully cultivated, each plant a testament to patience and delicate care. They were her rebellion against the harsh realities of the town, living proof that beauty could be nurtured even in challenging environments. Coach Marcus Thompson represented the town's institutional memory. He'd watched generations of students pass through the high school, understanding that education was about more than academic achievement. It was about character, about teaching young people to stand up for themselves and their community. The news of Jake's confrontation spread through unofficial channels, coffee shop conversations, quick phone calls, whispered updates during grocery shopping. In small towns, information traveled faster and more effectively than any official communication network. Each person who heard the story saw something different. For some, it was a moment of potential change. For others, it was a dangerous provocation that might bring retribution. But nobody could ignore it. The collective psychology of Millbrook was shifting, like tectonic plates preparing for a fundamental realignment. The Reapers' seemingly invincible control was showing its first genuine cracks. Backyard basketball had always been more than a game for the Carter brothers. It was a language of communication, a ritual that allowed for conversations that might otherwise feel too direct or uncomfortable. The rhythm of the ball against the pavement created a metronome of connection, allowing emotions to surface gradually. Jake's deployment had created a distance that went beyond physical separation. Military service changed people in ways that were hard to articulate. Dylan had watched his brother transform from a high school athlete to a disciplined soldier, each return home revealing subtle changes in perspective, in understanding of the world. The conversation about the Reapers wasn't just about a local gang. It was about power dynamics, about understanding how communities internalize fear, about the psychological mechanisms that allow oppression to continue unchallenged. Jake had seen similar patterns in conflict zones abroad, how fear could paralyze entire populations, turning potential resistance into silent compliance. Their backyard, with its well-worn basketball court and the old oak tree their father had planted years ago, was a sanctuary of memory and potential. It represented continuity, the idea that despite external pressures, some fundamental things remained constant: family, hope, the belief in positive change. Dylan's missed shots were telling. His muscle memory was intact, but his mental focus was disrupted. The confrontation with the Reapers had shaken something fundamental in his understanding of his hometown, of his own potential for resistance. Jake understood that courage wasn't about fearlessness, but about functioning effectively despite fear. His military training had taught him that true strength emerged from understanding complex situations, from strategic thinking rather than reactive aggression. The gathering dusk seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from this moment of familial connection and community tension. Eleanor Wright's flower shop was more than a business, it was a living archive of Millbrook's resilience. Each orchid represented a story of careful nurturing, of patience in the face of challenging conditions. The white petals were like silent witnesses to the town's transformation. The gathering of Sarah Martinez, Eleanor Wright, and Frank Chen was unprecedented. The Reapers had carefully maintained divisions, ensuring that local business owners remained isolated, suspicious of one another. This moment of shared coffee and conversation was itself an act of rebellion. Sarah's son, a community organizer in the nearby city, had been telling her about grassroots movements, about how change often started with simple conversations, with people deciding to see each other as allies rather than competitors. Jake Carter's actions had provided the spark that might ignite a larger transformation. Frank Chen's immigrant history was etched into every corner of his hardware store. His parents had arrived with nothing, building a life through hard work and community support. The protection money paid to the reapers felt like a betrayal of that original dream of American opportunity. The street outside remained quiet, but something had shifted. The usual tension, the sense of being constantly watched, had begun to dissipate. It was as if the town was taking a collective breath, preparing for something new. Eleanor's decision about her building was more than a business choice. It was a declaration of dignity, a refusal to be defined by fear. Her mother's legacy, embodied in the flower shop, demanded more than mere survival. It demanded respect. The conversation flowed around them, a mixture of local gossip, shared concerns, and emerging hope. For the first time in years, they were speaking freely, without looking over their shoulders. The Reapers Clubhouse was a monument to a particular kind of masculine pain. Located in an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town, it bore the marks of multiple transformations, from industrial space to a sanctuary of lost veterans seeking connection. Reed's anger was more complex than simple rage. It was the fury of someone who had once believed in systemic structures, military hierarchy, national purpose, and now found himself discarded, marginalized. The Reapers were his attempt to recreate the sense of purpose and brotherhood he'd experienced during his military service. Mike Crusher Davidson represented a different type of gang member. Younger, less invested in the original vision, he was more pragmatic about the group's survival. The changing dynamics in Millbrook threatened not just their control, but their entire economic model of intimidation and extraction. Tom "Ghost" Wilson watched everything with the detachment of someone who had seen too much. His weathered face was a map of experiences, military service, personal loss, years of compromise. He understood the delicate psychology of groups, how quickly apparent strength could become vulnerability. The wooden boards of the clubhouse floor had their own history. They had absorbed countless conversations, plans, moments of camaraderie and conflict. Each scuff mark told a story of masculine performance, of pain transformed into a twisted version of community. Reed's fist against the wall was more than a physical act. It was a manifestation of his growing sense of irrelevance, of a world changing faster than he could adapt. The Reapers had always presented themselves as immovable, and now that image was crumbling. The silence among the gang members was telling. Some avoided eye contact, others shifted uncomfortably. The unquestioning loyalty that had sustained them was showing its first genuine cracks. Veterans' meetings were sacred spaces, part support group, part philosophical forum, part family reunion. Here, the usual social masks fell away, replaced by a profound understanding that transcended civilian experiences. Jake's presence was both familiar and slightly alien to the other veterans. His youth, his recent deployment, represented a different generation of military service. The conflicts had changed, the geopolitical landscapes were more complex, but the fundamental human experiences remained consistent. Ghost Wilson's leather jacket was more than clothing. It was a complex symbol, part Reapers gang attire, part military veterans history, part personal mythology. Each patch, each wear mark told a story of survival, of adaptation. The connection to Colonel James Harrison was deeper than a simple military hierarchy. Harrison represented a particular kind of leadership, one that understood war was about more than combat, about maintaining human dignity even in the most challenging circumstances. These veterans had seen the world at its most brutal and its most compassionate. They understood that heroism wasn't about grand gestures, but about small moments of human connection, of choosing integrity over convenience. The community center itself was a testament to local resilience. Originally a WPA project from the Great Depression, it had survived multiple economic and social transformations. Its walls held memories of countless community gatherings, of hope persistently renewed. Jake's attentive listening was itself a form of service. By creating space for these stories, he was participating in a healing process that extended far beyond individual experiences. The community center had always been a neutral ground in Millbrook. Unlike other spaces that had been subtly colonized by fear, this building represented a potential for collective action, for reimagining community possibilities. Frank Chen's family history added depth to his statement. His father, a Vietnamese immigrant who had survived war and displacement, understood that bullying took many forms, from military occupation to economic intimidation. This was more than a local confrontation, it was a continuation of a larger struggle for dignity. Sarah Martinez spoke not just for herself, but for a generation of small business owners who had watched their dreams slowly erode. Her late husband, a local police officer who had tried to maintain community standards, represented a lost ideal of local governance and protection. Eleanor Wright's description of intimidation wasn't just about her flower shop. It was a broader narrative about how power operates in small communities, how fear can be weaponized to maintain control. Coach Thompson's apology was a profound moment of institutional accountability. By acknowledging his previous compliance, he was modeling a form of moral courage that went beyond individual actions. The community center's architecture told its own story. Built during the New Deal era, it represented a moment of collective hope, of believing that community institutions could transform social realities. Its sturdy brick walls and wide windows seemed to echo with past conversations of resistance and renewal. Outside, Reed's observation of the meeting was itself a moment of psychological transformation. Watching his control slip away, witnessing collective resistance, he was being forced to confront the fundamental fragility of his power structure. The Dawn attack was more than vandalism, it was a desperate attempt to reassert control through intimidation. Each broken window, each slashed tire was a message written in the language of fear that had dominated Millbrook for years. The spray-painted words, "Traitors die," revealed the psychological desperation of the Reapers. They understood that their power was not just physical, but deeply psychological. By labeling resistance as betrayal, they were attempting to activate old fear mechanisms. Eleanor's flower shop was particularly symbolic. Flowers represented hope, renewal, the possibility of beauty emerging from difficult conditions. The shattered glass was a violent attempt to destroy that symbolism. Frank Chen's delivery truck represented economic survival. For immigrant families like his, each vehicle was more than transportation, it was a lifeline, a means of economic mobility, a symbol of hard-won opportunity. Sarah Martinez's diner had always been more than a restaurant. It was a community gathering space, a place where local narratives were shared, where social bonds were maintained. The vandalism was an attack on these intangible but crucial community connections. The local teenagers who came to help Eleanor clean up represented a generational shift. They had grown up hearing stories of the Reapers' dominance, but Jake Carter's actions had provided a different script for resistance. Local contractors offering free repairs wasn't just an economic gesture. It was a statement of collective solidarity, a refusal to be defined by fear. The hardware store's transformation into a support center demonstrated how physical spaces could become sites of community reorganization and resistance. Colonel James Harrison's arrival in Millbrook caused a stir. His military vehicle pulled up in front of Lou's diner, and he stepped out in full dress uniform, his combat decorations glinting in the sunlight. Jake met him with a crisp salute. "At ease, Sergeant Carter," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "I hear you've got a situation that needs addressing." Harrison's history with Millbrook ran deeper than most knew. Years ago, he had been a young officer stationed near the town during a critical military training exercise. He had seen the potential in local communities, understood how systemic challenges could break down social structures. The vehicle itself was a symbol, a military-grade SUV that spoke of both authority and precision. Its polished exterior reflected the morning sunlight, creating a stark contrast with the weathered buildings of Main Street. Local residents watched from windows and doorways, a mixture of curiosity and hope etched on their faces. Jake's relationship with Harrison went beyond typical military hierarchy. The colonel had been more than a commanding officer, he had been a mentor, someone who understood that leadership was about more than giving orders. During Jake's most challenging deployments, Harrison had provided guidance that went beyond military strategy, focusing on personal integrity and community responsibility. They didn't have to wait long. The rumble of motorcycles announced the Reaper's arrival, with Reed leading the pack. The gang leader's face showed recognition and shock when he saw Harrison. The street seemed to hold its breath. Years of tension, of carefully maintained power dynamics, were about to be challenged. Local business owners who had been watching from safe distances now found themselves drawn closer, unable to look away from the unfolding confrontation. Harrison's presence was deliberate. He wasn't just there to support Jake or confront Reed, he was there to demonstrate a different kind of power. Military leadership, at its best, was about protection, about creating spaces where communities could thrive. "Hello, Thomas," Harrison said calmly. "It's been a long time." Reed's real name hung in the air like smoke. "Colonel," he managed, his usual bravado cracking. The moment was laden with history. Years of unspoken tensions, of pain and misunderstanding, were about to be brought into the light. The Reaper's motorcycles idled, their engines a low, threatening rumble that contrasted with Harrison's calm demeanor. Local veterans who had been watching from the periphery began to move closer. Ghost Wilson stood among them, his leather jacket a bridge between his past with the Reapers and his emerging role in the community's healing. Jake stood slightly behind Harrison, his posture straight but not rigid. He was both support and witness, understanding that this moment was about more than a personal confrontation. It was about the town's future, about breaking cycles of fear and intimidation. The morning sunlight seemed to pause, casting long shadows across Main Street. In this moment, Millbrook held its collective breath, waiting to see how the story would unfold. The truth came out in front of the gathered town. Reed had served under Harrison, had been a promising young soldier until a failed mission left him bitter and angry. He'd built the Reapers from other disillusioned veterans, twisting their pain into power over others. The mission that broke Reed was more than a military failure, it was a profound psychological wound. In a remote village in Iraq, a humanitarian operation had gone catastrophically wrong. Intelligence had been faulty, civilian casualties had been high, and the young Lieutenant Reed had been forced to make impossible choices that would haunt him for years. Detailed reports surfaced, revealing the complexity of that fateful mission. A convoy of humanitarian workers had been caught in a crossfire between local militia and coalition forces. Reed's unit had been tasked with evacuation and protection, but the situation deteriorated rapidly. Miscommunication, fear, and the chaos of conflict had led to a tragic outcome that decimated both the humanitarian team and local civilians. Harrison produced military documents, carefully preserved records that told a story of institutional failure and individual trauma. Each page was a testament to the psychological toll of modern warfare, how one moment, one decision could shatter a person's sense of purpose and moral certainty. The gathered townspeople listened in hushed silence. Many were family members of veterans, others were community members who had only known the Reapers through fear. Now they were witnessing the human story behind the violence, the pain that had been transformed into years of local terrorization. Reed stood exposed, not just as a gang leader, but as a wounded soldier who had never found a way to heal. His tattoos, his leather jacket, his entire persona suddenly seemed like a fragile armor constructed to protect a deeply wounded spirit. Harrison understood the depth of that trauma better than anyone. Military service wasn't just about combat, it was about navigating moral complexities, about maintaining humanity in inhumane circumstances. Reed's transformation from a dedicated soldier to a local gang leader was a testament to how unprocessed trauma could warp a person's understanding of strength and purpose. The town watched in hushed silence as the details emerged. Each revelation was like another layer of an onion being peeled back, exposing the raw, vulnerable core of human pain that had driven the Reaper's reign of terror. Reed's gang had never been simply about criminal enterprise, it had been a desperate attempt to recreate the sense of brotherhood, of purpose that military service had provided. "You taught us about strength," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But you forgot the most important lesson: true strength lies in protecting others, not dominating them." Each word was a surgical strike, cutting through the mythology Reed had constructed around himself and his gang. The Reapers had been built on a foundation of wounded masculinity, of men who had felt discarded by the very system they had once served with pride. Ghost stepped forward, removing his Reaper's jacket. The leather garment fell to the ground, a symbol of an identity being shed. Others followed, until Reed stood alone, his empire crumbling around him. The jackets created a circle around Reed, a silent indictment, a collective rejection of the fear and intimidation he had used to control the town. Each removed jacket was an individual declaration of independence, of reclaiming personal and community dignity. "It's over, Thomas," Harrison said softly. "Let it go." In that moment, Reed was not just a gang leader being stripped of power. He was a man confronting the accumulated weight of his own pain, his own misguided attempts to find meaning and connection. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but pregnant with possibility, the silence of a community preparing to heal, to understand, to move forward. The changes in Millbrook didn't happen overnight, but they were profound. The Reapers disbanded, many of them joining Harrison's veteran support program. Reed left town, but not before facing legal consequences for years of extortion and intimidation. The process of healing was complex and multi-layered. Each former gang member carried a different story, a unique path toward redemption. Harrison's veteran support program wasn't just about rehabilitation, it was about reconstruction of identity, about helping men find purpose beyond violence and intimidation. A deep psychological transformation began to sweep through the community. Local therapists, many of whom had been reluctant to engage with the Reapers in the past, now worked closely with Harrison's program. They developed specialized group sessions that addressed trauma, community reintegration, and personal accountability. The legal proceedings against Reed and some of his top lieutenants became a public process of accountability. Unlike previous years of silent intimidation, the town chose transparency. Court proceedings were open, victims were heard, and the community learned the full extent of the Reapers' impact. Local schools implemented new programs focused on conflict resolution, community building, and understanding the psychological roots of violence. Students learned about restorative justice, about how communities could heal rather than simply punish. Ghost Wilson's transformation became a powerful narrative of hope. His motorcycle repair shop was more than a business, it was a living testament to the possibility of change. Each engine he repaired, each young person he mentored, represented a small act of community rebuilding. The local high school started a mentorship program inspired by Ghost's work. Troubled teenagers found themselves learning not just mechanical skills, but life lessons about integrity, hard work, and personal responsibility. The shop became a sanctuary, a place where potential was recognized and nurtured. Jake watched as his brother helped Ghost Wilson set up the legitimate motorcycle repair shop. Dylan had discovered a natural talent for teaching, for breaking down complex mechanical concepts into understandable pieces. His patience rivaled Ghost's, and together they created a space of genuine learning and transformation. The repair shop became more than a business, it was a symbol of Millbrook's resilience. Where once motorcycles had represented fear and intimidation, now they symbolized craftsmanship, skill, and community connection. Eleanor's flower shop bloomed again, her orchids displayed proudly in the repaired window. Each flower seemed to tell a story of recovery, of beauty emerging from damage. Local artists began to use the shop as a gathering space, creating a new cultural center that celebrated creativity and renewal. Frank Chen's hardware store transformed into a community hub, hosting weekly meetings for local business owners. These gatherings were more than professional networking, they were opportunities for collective problem solving, for reimagining the town's economic future. Sarah Martinez's diner was always full now, the sound of laughter replacing the former fearful silence. She began hosting community events, cooking classes for teenagers, storytelling nights that brought different generations together. The space became a living archive of Millbrook's resilience, each meal a celebration of community strength. Local government began to change as well. Inspired by the community's transformation, new leadership emerged, people who understood that true governance was about empowerment, not control. Policies shifted toward supporting small businesses, creating youth programs, and healing old community wounds. The town's transformation was not just about removing the Reapers. It was about creating a new narrative of collective strength, of understanding that true community emerges from compassion, accountability, and shared hope. 1 year later, Jake stood in the newly dedicated community garden, watching as Dylan taught younger kids how to plant tomatoes. The garden had been Ghost's idea, a way to give back to the town he'd helped terrorize. The garden was more than a physical space, it was a living metaphor for Millbrook's transformation. Each carefully tended plant represented a story of healing, of potential realized through patience and collective care. The soil itself seemed to hold memories of the town's journey, from a place of fear to a community of hope. Former reapers worked alongside high school students, community leaders, and retired veterans. Their shared labor broke down the old barriers of fear and suspicion. Teenagers who might have once been intimidated now worked side by side with men who had once ruled through violence, learning that redemption was a collective process. Local schools had incorporated the garden into their curriculum. Science classes studied ecological systems, history classes explored community development, art classes found inspiration in the growing landscape. What had begun as a small project had become a multifaceted educational opportunity. Beautiful sight, isn't it? Harrison asked, joining Jake by the fence. The colonel had retired and moved to Millbrook, his presence helping to heal old wounds and build new bridges. Yes, sir, Jake replied. Though I never thought I'd see Ghost Wilson growing vegetables. Harrison's laugh was deep and genuine. The transformation wasn't just about the garden, but about the fundamental human capacity for change. Each planted seed, each carefully tended row represented a choice to grow instead of destroy, to nurture instead of control. The garden became a living testament to Millbrook's resilience. Local restaurants began using its produce. Community events were hosted among the growing plants. What had once been a symbol of division was now a center of unity. Harrison smiled. Strength comes in many forms, Sergeant. Sometimes it's standing your ground. Sometimes it's knowing when to change course. Jake watched as Eleanor Wright showed a group of former reapers how to care for the roses they'd planted. Frank Chen's daughter was teaching Sarah Martinez's grandson how to water the seedlings. Coach Thompson and his team had built the garden beds themselves. The intergenerational connections were profound. Elderly residents who had lived in fear now shared stories with young people who were learning a different way of community building. Each conversation was a bridge, each shared moment of gardening a small act of healing. The funny thing about courage, Jake said quietly, is that it spreads. Like seeds in the wind. Harrison nodded. And like seeds, it grows into something bigger than itself. He gestured to the thriving garden, the laughing children, the reformed men finding peace in the soil. This is what real power looks like, Jake. Not fear, not control, but growth. Community. Hope. Dylan waved from across the garden, his hands dirty from planting, his smile bright in the summer sun. Jake waved back, feeling the rightness of it all. The town had faced its fears, had found its strength, and like the gardens they now tended, was growing toward the light. The garden was more than a physical space. It was a promise, a living, growing promise of what communities could become when they chose hope over fear, understanding over conflict, growth over stagnation.